And then there was the Free Soil Party, and there were the remnants of the Whigs, remnants of the Free Soil, remnants of the Know Nothing Party, and a new little party started forming out in Wisconsin that they called the Republican Party. And they got the name Republican because in the 1820s there were the Democratic Republicans, and Andy Jackson grabbed Democrats, so Republican was what was left, so they brought back the name Republican, and they started meeting and what have you. And around in the 1850s, early 1850s, they had a sort of a secret meeting in a place called Mayville, New York. And in this secret meeting in Mayville, New York, they had representatives coming from New England, representatives coming from the Midwest, and they came in on boats on Lake Erie, and they met in Mayville, and they formed the national basis for the National Republican Party.
A lot of the Westfield people were involved, I might add.
Oh yeah, a lot of Westfield people were involved. And Seward, of course, had spent some time in Westfield before that. He was very much involved, and they formed the very first Republican newspaper in the United States, the Westfield Republican, still there.
Still running?
Still there, right.
Absolutely.
Very first one. At any rate,
that was very interesting.
At any rate, in 1856, the new Republican Party ran Fremont. And Fremont was just a sectional candidate, just the northern part of the United States. And of course, Buchanan from Pennsylvania, he was elected, and Breckinridge, his vice president, was elected, and we had Buchanan and Breckinridge. Well, Buchanan came along at the time that the Republican Party took control of the House of Representatives and then eventually moved into power in the United States Senate. And there was real strong battles at that point between the new Republican Party and the older existing Democratic Party. And things were in really a lot of dissension in the country at that point. And there was the whole slavery issue and also women's rights issue also emerging at about that time. So there was a lot more controversy, more politically divided in the United States during the early 1800s coming up until 1860. That kind of comes back to, I think, your original question, your original point.
She was interested, I noticed, in the shenanigans that went on with Seward and the Abe Lincoln and the 1860 election. And you wrote a book about that in part.
This is in one of the books I have here, is the Visionary book. I wrote this some years ago. And if you want to talk a little bit about that, I can go through. And
well, I'm going to get off and let somebody else.
Well, thank you very much, caller. Send me a stamped envelope. I'll give you a couple of $5 off at the Lakeview Restaurant at the foot of the hill here in Mayville, right across from the museum. You'll love it.
Okay. Coming back to 1860.
Yeah, 1860.
That was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, quite a couple.
A couple of years ago. 1860. The Democrats, they got together in Charleston, South Carolina. They had a meeting there, a big national convention in April of that year. They wanted to get an early start. They were feeling very strongly about the situation. So all the Democrats in the United States at that time, 34 states, they all congregate in Charleston, South Carolina. And they start meeting. And they meet for day after day after day, and they have 56 ballots. And at the end of 56 ballots, it's still split. We find the Southern delegates, they want to go with Breckinridge, who had been the vice president for Buchanan. And the Northern Democrats, they wanted to go with Douglas from Illinois. And they had the 56 ballots, finally gave up, and they went home.
Quit, they just left.
They just quit. So the Northern Democrats, they got together later, a few weeks later in Baltimore, and they selected Douglas. He's our candidate. The Southern Democrats, they got together again in Richmond, I believe, and they selected Breckinridge. So we had two Democratic candidates. Now the Democrats who didn't like Douglas, who didn't like Breckinridge, they got together and they nominated Bell from Tennessee. So suddenly we now have three Democrats running for President of the United States.
All officially nominated.
All officially nominated by their own branch of the Democratic Party. Okay. Democrats were about as well organized then as they are today.
So this was 1860. Right?
1860. In the meantime, the Republicans, which was an abolitionist party, only existed in New England and the northern states, decided to hold their convention in Chicago. And Chicago at that point was way away from the center of activity typically. And the Illinois Central Railroad played a big role in this because the Illinois Central Railroad was looking for federal funds for the railroad grants and things like this. So they built this great big wooden building down on the waterfront in Chicago, which they called the teepee. And this big wooden building, and they were going to bring all of the delegates for the new Republican Party to the teepee in Chicago. And they made a lot of advance, arrangements. For example, the doors in the teepee locked from the inside, not from the outside. So you got to lock them from the inside, which is a little bit unusual, but nevertheless they did that. And the mayor of Chicago was a fellow named Whitworth at that time. He decided to bring in Allen Pinkerton and his detectives so they could have security and order at this new Republican convention. And then Pinkerton's people, all these detectives, took on a number of other tasks. Says, first of all, they mailed out discreet brochures and guest passes to various clubs in the city. Then they printed thousands of fake credentials, thousands of them, and organized a vast horde of Illinois Central, Chicago, and Northwestern employees to show up at a special time in the convention proceedings. Then they finally scheduled steamboat rides on Lake Michigan, mailed out brochures and so on and so forth, and then they were all set for the convention, the people to start coming to the convention. Now, William Seward had been involved in Westfield, became the governor of New York State, was involved in the United States Senate, strong advocate for abolition. He was the favored candidate. People assumed that it was a foregone conclusion. He went to the Republican Party in about the same way that Mr. Romney is coming to this Republican convention, okay? About the same way.
It's just a coronation.
Just a coronation. He's going to come to Chicago. He brought 18 carloads of supporters along with him. And they had the cannons all set up in his hometown to boom out the announcement that he had received the nomination as soon as they got the telegram, right? But what happened? Thurlow Weed was involved with organizing Seward's campaign. And he arrived with 70 delegates, all sworn to go along with Seward. 13 railroad cars of supporters, all pledged to secure William Seward. When Thurlow arrived at the convention center, he discovered, to his horror, that the New York State delegation was seated far away from the New England and New Jersey delegations. It's going to make it more difficult to communicate with the supporters. The support of the Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey delegations were crucial to secure Seward's nomination. Seating arrangement made it difficult to communicate. Even so, Seward's supporters came in, they filled the galleries, jammed into the hall, and they surrounded the whole floor of the convention center. Pinkerton agents, though, they were kind of in disguise. They sort of infiltrated the crowd quietly and quietly distributed passes to various clubs and things like that and gave everybody free tickets for the steamboat rides on Lake Michigan. First 2 days of the convention were devoted to reviewing the credentials, accepting the delegates, working out internal housekeeping details, approving the platform. Okay, now, they worked on the committee. They had plank 15 of the 15 planks in the platform. Talked about federal funds for river, harbor improvements, and plank 16, the last plank, promised that the federal government would provide immediate and aid to construct a railroad to the Pacific Ocean. Now, said Norman Judd, but David Davis, who were Lincoln's campaign advisors, spent their time lining up votes for states that did not want to see Seward nominated. Indiana committed their 26 votes to Lincoln, nearby. Maine delegation lined up in New Hampshire, and Davis lined up Pennsylvania's second ballot votes by offering a cabinet position to Simon
A
Camden.
little wheel and deal in here.
Yeah, and they got Maine to come along because they offered the vice presidential nomination to Hannibal Hamlin, an attorney in Bangor, Maine, that nobody much knew about, but they said, you can be the vice president. So they get this thing all lined up. In the meantime, though, the Pinkerton agents, they got word of a big parade and rally that's going to be planned by the Seward supporters on the morning of the nomination. Finally comes, third day, the day of the nomination. Third day finally arrives. 1,500 Seward supporters suddenly rose from their seats in the visitors' gallery, marched down the stairways, out into the street to begin their carefully orchestrated, spontaneous show of support for William Seward. Delegates rushed from the hall. A uniformed brass band suddenly appeared, joined the rally. They started a triumphal march through the streets of Chicago. The band led the way down to the waterfront, back to the teepee, back to the convention center, and then the Seward supporters and delegates were now ready to return to the hall and dominate the proceedings as they nominated William Seward as the Republican candidate for President of the United States.
But
To their horror, the Seward supporters discovered that the doors to the convention center were locked. They couldn't get in. Pinkerton agents refused to open the doors. People were pounding on the doors. While the Seward supporters were out of the hall, over 2,000 Lincoln men, armed with fake credentials, stormed into the building, filled the galleries, took their place. The galleries were now packed with Lincoln supporters, and the New York delegates who left the floor of the convention to participate in the demonstration found themselves locked outside the hall. Pandemonium reigned outside the hall as the Seward supporters fought to gain entry to the building. Hordes of Chicago policemen descended upon the throng, started carrying them off. Then they start calling the ballots. The chair called the first ballot. Seward led with 173 votes.
even though they were all outside.
Yeah, still had those other people inside. They're still voting. Lincoln was next with 102. Cameron got 50. Chase got 49. Bates ended up with 48. Second ballot immediately called. Vermont and Pennsylvania shifted to Lincoln. Seward now had 184 votes. Lincoln had 181. Ballot 3 was called. When the votes were cast, Lincoln had 231 and a half votes. 1.5 votes shy of getting the nomination. Hush fell over the convention as old Judge Wilkeson, a prominent member of the Ohio delegation, rose to his feet, demanded the attention of the chair. The chair granted the floor to Judge Wilkinson, and Judge Wilkinson relinquished the floor to Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter stood up and announced the change of 4 votes from Mr. Chase to Mr. Lincoln. The audience erupted. Cannon stationed outside the convention hall fired volley after volley, and Abraham Lincoln, dark horse from Illinois, local railroad attorney, received the Republican nomination for President of the United States.
There you go.
That's what happened in
That was the
1860.
that was the first Republican nomination.
That's
wasn't
right.
it? Yeah.
Second, Fremont was first, but this was but Lincoln, of course, showed up on the ballots of all of the northern states. Lincoln did not show up on the ballot of any southern state.
Really?
He wasn't there. Wasn't there. And the southern states, of course, they voted for Breckinridge, Democrats. Northern Democrats, they voted for Douglas. Some voted for Bell. But then there was a solid block for Lincoln, and Lincoln ended up winning the nomination. As soon as he won the nomination, the words spread across the country at that time, primarily by newspaper, and the people in the South were actually horrified. They were dumbstruck that this northern abolitionist candidate was now the President of the United States. And that's when South Carolina finally made the decision, okay, we're out of here. And they moved out, and followed immediately by other states. And Buchanan, of course, was president while all of this was going on, and he just watched the states